Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Foreign Policy Editor-in-Chief, Ravi Agrawal.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Ravi Agrawal. I'm the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine. Good morning to all of you here. Thank you for coming. I know you've probably all received 4 or 5 invitations to be at various places today, so I thank you for choosing this, FP's Tech Forum. And I promise it's going to be a fascinating, engaging next couple of hours with some great discussions. We have some terrific speakers from government and from private sector. And I also want to welcome all of our viewers from around the world who are tuning in on live stream. Good day, good evening, happy Thursday. It's great to have you all with us. Now, this is the start of FP's Tech Summit, and I have to say, historically, usually, tech has not been a big part of the UN General Assembly week or the agenda. This time it really feels like it is. President Biden mentioned it in his speech. He sort of riffed on AI when he said that AI has enormous peril and enormous promise. Ukraine's President Zelensky mentioned it in his speech in the context of war and security. Foreign ministers from a range of countries have been meeting to discuss AI, but also cybersecurity. The private sector has had a series of meetings with world leaders as well. Tech really is important this week. And I think we're also at a point now where, more than ever before, tech policy and how we think about tech policy is foreign policy, which is also the name of our magazine. So it's apt that we are here today. Just a few other notes before we get started. I want to thank our sponsors. They are AARP, SAP, and the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. Thank you for supporting us and making this event possible. And then lastly, I would also like to just welcome you in the audience to participate. So there are a couple of ways in which you can ask questions. I will take some questions from the audience. For those of you here, there's a nifty QR code on your seats. You can try that out, and that'll take you to a place where you can ask questions. My colleague Claire over there will then end up putting it to our speakers who are here and just warming up, about to come on. If you are watching us on live stream, very easy. There's a question button. Just press that, ask a question, and I will try to bring you in. And I think that's that. So it is now my great pleasure to welcome on our first guest. He is the U.S. Ambassador at Large for Cyberspace and Digital Policy, Nathaniel Fick. Let's hear a round of applause for him, please. All right, Ambassador, it's great to see you in person here.
Good morning. It's good to be here. Thank you for having me.
You read my book. I like you.
I did read your book. I was just telling Ravi, when I travel, I try to read a book that's relevant to where I'm going. And so I read Ravi's wonderful book about the advent of the smartphone in India on a trip to the G20 recently.
So before we dive into the nuts and bolts of this conversation, it just occurs to me in 20 seconds, just explain what you do. And the reason why this is important is you're the first person to have this role.
Yes. So we set up a new bureau at the State Department. Bureaus are our unit of action to integrate and elevate our approach to tech diplomacy. And you said it in your opening remarks. Tech policy and foreign policy are increasingly inseparable. So cybersecurity, telecommunications, and digital issues broadly, critical and emerging technology, and the digital freedom, rights-respecting agenda that undergirds all of it.
Yeah. So I'll come to UNGA Week in a second, but you were at the G20 sort of breakout kind of meeting in Bengaluru on, I think that was digital inclusion or digitization, which leads to inclusive growth. Just give us a sense of what was achieved there.
So the G20 digital ministerial track under India's leadership has focused quite a bit on digital public infrastructure, on DPI, and the broader issues of digital governance and how governments are increasingly connecting with their people using digital means, bringing government services to people, circumventing corruption. There are a lot of wonderful advantages, and that technology stack needs to be developed in an organic, transparent, rights-respecting way.
So, I mean, India, for example, has been thinking about this in a very intelligent way, I think, for more than a decade now with India's stack. What's changed? So how does this become something that countries can collaborate on?
One thing that's changed is the proliferation of smartphones, which puts the power of that stack in the hands of individual citizens at an achievable cost. That's a huge change. I walked around a market in Bengaluru with an Indian counterpart and watched him buy fruit in 10 rupee transactions, and it was seamless. That's extraordinary, and it didn't exist a decade ago. And people broadly, I think, are taking more of an API-based approach to software architecture. So it's increasingly possible to think about, okay, how do we architect these systems so that they are interoperable? A bad outcome would be a bunch of kind of vertically integrated national stacks. A better outcome would be more interoperability.
But then doesn't that come with, I mean, to use Biden's phrase, peril as well?
I would say that in life, risk and return are, in fact, mostly correlated. And it's important to build security in, of course. Look at what happened in Albania. The Albanian government did a terrific job of rolling out a comprehensive e-Albania platform, and then it promptly got taken down in an Iranian cyber attack. So you have to build security in, and then I think also human rights issues need to be baked into the design, development, deployment of the software.
So on that, on collaborating on security, and I guess this is a question about G20, but I want to now take us to UNGA as well. When you have these big groups, and the G20's become an even bigger group now that it will include the African Union, which is, you know, another 55 countries, these groups are unwieldy. There's a lot of disagreement within member states. At the UN, even more so. So give us a insider's peek into some of the discussions this week on how you navigate, you know, relationships that are fraught between some member states when you begin to discuss things like partnering on security.
I'm a chief executive in my temperament, and so multilateral diplomacy is does not always lend itself to a chief executive's temperament. And boy, it's essential. So I think the fundamental tension, in my view, is with broader groups, you get legitimacy. With smaller groups, you get efficacy. And both matter. And so Secretary Blinken likes to talk about variable geometry and the idea of partnerships and alliances that are fit for purpose. And the simple answer is we have to engage in all of them. And one thing that I think has been very clear to the United States and to our allies and partners around the world, certainly in the last decade, is that when we take a step back, just as nature abhors a vacuum, others fill the void. And others who may have a more authoritarian, top-down approach to technology development and deployment, who have a different vision of a shared technology future. And so this week, UNGA High Level Week for us has been about building as big a tent as possible, including as many countries as possible, in a shared affirmative vision of the future that we want tech to play in our societies.
And how much of this discussion is about hardware, is about collaborating on, you know, everything from undersea cables to satellites, and how much of it is about, you know, the softer side of it?
Yeah, well, one of the reasons this issue set is so cool is you get to do both. You know, there's physical stuff, hardware that gets built, that gets deployed. You know, the cables get deployed off of ships and big spools. You know, I was just at the undersea cable repair depot in Sri Lanka, and you know, the intersection of the physical and the digital, the physical and the cerebral is one of the things that's cool about this space.
I have to ask you to linger on that. So there's an undersea repair depot in Sri Lanka. Who runs this?
So undersea, we spend a lot of time and energy, I think, all of us in the tech policy community focused on 5G and wireless. It's worth remembering that that's the last 2 miles of connectivity. The 10,000 miles before that, more or less run under the ocean. The internet's not up in the sky, it's basically under the seafloor. And regionally, there are private contractors who have responsibility for repairing cables that are operated by different companies, mainly in their geography.
We've managed to get this far in the conversation without mentioning China or Russia. So let's go there quickly. In discussions this week, did they come up as actors that may make it more difficult to have the kinds of, collaborative relationships you're describing?
Of course. I mean, I think Russia has highlighted by its behavior that tech utopianism aside, we still live in a Westphalian system. That we still need to enforce the norms of the sanctity of national borders and the independence of states. And tech obviously is playing a huge role in the war in Ukraine. We are active supporters of our partners and allies in Ukraine across a whole suite of different technologies. And then with China, I think that the big overarching piece is the PRC has a fundamentally different view of what the relationship should be between a government and technology and citizens. And we are advocating for a much more organic, multi-stakeholder, rights-respecting approach to developing and deploying technology.
One of those technologies, AI. What is your sense of what has been advanced this week? I feel like everyone's bringing it up. Everyone's talking about it. We keep hearing about potential regulation, about, agreeing on rules of the road. But it seems to me we're still at the very, very early stages of any real collaboration or agreement on, even voluntary kind of requirements.
Very early is right. So from my perspective, generative AI kind of cracked into popular consciousness around the world about a year ago. It was really last fall that, for whatever reason, and I think we're still on that smooth exponential curve in terms of the advance of the models, but all of a sudden, for usability reasons or maybe media attention, all of a sudden, generative AI in particular became a thing for citizens around the world.
I think it's when it could crack the bar exam. That's when all of us freaked out.
And every government in the world said, we got to do something. And if you ask the next question, well, what would you like to do? There was no answer.
Yeah.
So I'm actually really proud of the approach the U.S. has taken, which is to work with the leading companies to develop a set of voluntary commitments governing the use of generative AI, commitments around safety of the models, security of the models, and trust of their output. And now this week, we've been working really to multilateralize those commitments, to get more companies around the world to sign on to them, and then to translate them into guiding principles and a code of conduct that can be common across the G7 in terms of narrow groups and efficacy. We're feeding into the UK AI Safety Summit to be held later this fall. And then obviously at the United Nations, Secretary Blinken hosted an event on Monday focused on the application of AI to the SDGs. So 88% of the Sustainable Development Goals are off track. Without a major intervention to alter the slope of the line, we're not going to hit them. And the best shot, perhaps the best shot, certainly one of the best shots we have, is the application of critical and emerging technologies. So what can AI do for good in arenas that are common to everyone? Climate modeling, weather forecasting, medical diagnostics, agricultural productivity. So one of the more exciting parts of the week for me was hearing the companies present alongside foreign ministers about the application of AI to the SDGs.
Can you expand on that a little bit? So is there anything in that area that's tangible that could happen in the next year or so?
I think we're going to see fundamentally better weather forecasting, which if you live in New York or you live in San Francisco, might not change your life that much. If you're a farmer in parts of the developing world, it changes your life. It changes your personal economics. It changes whether people in your community go hungry or not. And that's not in the distant future. It's now.
You know, riffing again off of the peril promise kind of dichotomy, do you think the way in which all of us are currently thinking and talking about AI, have we swung too much on the peril kind of side of things, or is that justified?
You're asking an entrepreneur. So my answer is that governments populated by people who are in positions of public trust are rightly and understandably conservative, rightly and understandably sometimes risk averse because the consequences are high. I think it's essential that maintaining our innovative advantage remains our North Star when we're talking about AI and AI development. The upside potential here is enormous. The benefit to humanity is enormous. Every technology innovation in history has brought peril with it, of course. And the arc of history, aided by technology, I would argue, is generally a positive one in terms of health, education, human welfare, inclusivity of all people. Generally, we're trending positively across most metrics that matter. So yes, I think that our North Star is and must remain the potential of AI, the need to harness an vibrant, innovative private sector ecosystem to build and deploy these tools while mitigating risk. But we can't steer by risk mitigation, or else we don't go anywhere.
Just on the risk mitigation, one of the things that worries me a little bit about this sort of voluntary commitments, it almost sounds like an honor code of sorts. And honor codes can work for us in, you know, college exams, but we're in a very dishonorable world right now with bad actors that, you know, are looking to attack each other, that are destroying the UN Charter as we sit here at UNGA Week. Does it worry you that these commitments are just loose and easily destroyed?
Honor codes do require widely agreed upon and enforced norms. Honor codes do require enforcement mechanisms. So I think the voluntary commitments are a good first step, and I think we will continue to see mechanisms develop to ensure that they are being adhered to.
I'm going to try and take one or two questions from the audience. I see a yellow light flashing in front of me, so we don't have too much time. But any hands here? One here right in front. Okay, sir. I think there's a microphone there, and that's mostly for the live stream to catch it. But tell us your name and the question, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Imran Sharaf. I'm from the United Arab Emirates. I have a question regarding the current, going back to the point that you raised earlier, the polarization that's happening when it comes to the tech, science and tech in general, and how nations deal with it. In your point of view, in the future, would the path be more modeled in a way, or the approach would be more of choosing sides approach when it comes to collaborating in technologies between nations? Or is it going to be more of an accommodating approach in which you can work with whoever you want, however, with a specific kind of setup? Because currently it seems like more of it's a choosing sides approach. Do you think that's going to continue?
I think we are all to some extent prisoners of our own experience. The personal experience that I bring to that question is being the father of two teenage daughters. Pounding the table and saying it's my way or the highway is not an effective strategy with them. It is not an effective diplomatic strategy either. So, which is why we try to anchor, at least in the United States, try to anchor on the affirmative vision. What are we trying to do here? How is it good for all people? How can tech be used to do things that we can all agree are important to the world? Start there. Now, I'm not a naive idealist. I recognize that as countries take different approaches, some amount of balkanization is happening. We don't want that to happen. We want to minimize it. But some degree of it will happen if governments adhere to fundamentally different policies. But our North Star again, ought to be the upside, the potential, articulating an inclusive, positive, affirmative vision for what this technology future can be, and recognize that for a lot of states, they don't want to be wholly monogamous. They're not going to be wholly monogamous. It's not in their interest to be wholly monogamous, which gets back to the point of variable geometry and making sure that we have alliances and partnerships and relationships that are fit for purpose by circumstance.
A world of swing states. Ambassador Nathaniel Fick, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Ravi. Great to be here.
Great to have you
Thank
on.
you.
Pleasure. Thank you. And that was Ambassador Nathaniel Fick. Our next guest keeps us safe at night and even while we're awake. He is Brandon Wales. He's the Executive Director of CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Brandon Wales, everyone. Great to have you. Great to have you on.
No, really glad to be here.
Let me start with this. Which country worries you more right now when it comes to cyber threats, China or Russia?
I think clearly the answer is China. It is the most significant geopolitical challenge we have. I think one commentator had previously described it as Russia is a hurricane and China is climate change. And I think the scale of the Chinese cyber threats to the United States and to countries around the world is enormous, and it is going to be the defining, really, I think, the defining aspect of U.S. cybersecurity policy over the next decade.
On any given day, how many attacks does America deter?
Well, I think attacks that we deter is probably an impossible question to really factor in. But, you know, the internet is messy. On any given day, there are countless attacks, and those are going to come from a variety of places. They're going to be foreign nations attempting to probe cyber defenses for economic and political espionage, to preposition on U.S. critical infrastructure. And there are going to be an endless number of criminal organizations and hacktivists who are attempting to get inside of networks to advance their aims, whether that's illicit gain of money or to disrupt some type of business that they have a concern with. So, you know, it is a challenging environment, and it means that cyber defenders need to be on their A game at all times.
How has AI changed things? And I ask this because, you know, whenever there's a big new advance, you wonder, is this helping the bad guys or the good guys? Is it helping the people who want to attack, or does it exponentially improve your defensive capabilities?
Yeah, and I think this is AI is just the latest advancement in technology that poses kind of the same challenge, which is how do you reap all of the benefits that technology can offer while minimizing the risks that it will introduce into the environment. And do I think today that cyber actors are able to dramatically improve their capability because of AI? No. Is that a concern as AI continues to develop? Absolutely. You know, I think today some of the technology, some of the generative AI technology, particularly advances in helping coders become more efficient, can make people slightly better, can make them improve their abilities, you know, on the margins. But it is not making a novice, you know, it doesn't give a novice the ability to develop very sophisticated malware overnight. You know, what that looks like in months and years ahead, I think could be a much different story.
And so how do you even begin to prepare for that? Let's say, because we keep hearing the word exponential get thrown around, and let's say there is exponential growth in the capabilities of AI and how it sort of interplays with cyber offense and defense. Give us a sneak peek into how you're preparing for 6 months from now.
So I think we need to prepare a couple different ways. One, as you note, we need to figure out how do we harness the power of AI to improve as much as possible to get that same exponential improvement in our defenses. How do we already use various AI techniques, whether it's machine learning or other tools, to spot malicious cyber activity that's never been detected before. Well, how do we use these new advances in AI to give the advantages to the defenders? And that work is already underway across industry and government. So that's going to be one aspect of it that'll be important. I think the second is working with the private sector as they begin to build in AI tools into their networks, what are we doing to protect those? What kind of new risks does that introduce? And how does industry think about managing risks introduced by AI tools that are being used for critical applications that provide critical services to the American people? And third, I think it's working with the developers of those AI models to think about how do they build in security? How do they red team those models to make sure that it minimizes the potential harm that could come from them? That is a aspect of the voluntary commitments that I know you were speaking about with Ambassador Fick earlier. So we are thinking through that, but it is going to be a constant tension between how nefarious actors can use these tools and how we can try to gain advantage from them ourselves.
You mentioned the private sector, so I have a question on that I have wondered about for a while. There are some very powerful private sector players in developing AI, both in terms of like the physical end of stuff with the development of chips and all of that, but also on the software side. And, governments rely on the private sector for, security, obviously, but these are multinational actors. We all know the companies we're thinking about here, but they operate in countries that I think America would consider both allies and foes. As someone who works in government and who's responsible for security, how do you think through the use of private sector and collaborating with them?
I think at least in this space, in the AI space, most of the large companies that are working this now are Western companies. And they're companies that we have long-standing relationships with. And I think that there is a genuine commitment on their part to doing what they can to advance security interests, even as they're developing these new tools and as they operate in a global environment.
But to be clear, though, these are companies that still have immense amounts of business in other parts of the world.
Absolutely. And I do think that we, in any time we're working with companies, thinking about the potential risks of engagement is an aspect of that. But I will say that when it comes to the core issues that we focus on the security of globally connected systems, that is something that I think kind of cuts across all nations. And we should be thinking of it as kind of these core security aspects of our critical infrastructure should be a common good, the same way that countries that are friends and foes can collaborate on airline safety to make sure that planes can continue to fly around the world safely. We should be thinking about cybersecurity the same way. We do not want ransomware to proliferate regardless of where it is happening around the world. And so whether it's sharing information or collaborating on kind of what is happening, we put out a lot of our security information publicly because we want to benefit everyone. Whether that's used by friend or foe, we actually don't care because we want to minimize the overall prevalence of cybersecurity incidents regardless of where they're happening.
But doesn't that, I feel like part of the underlying assumption there, to use the airline analogy, is that this is a world of good actors. And, even with the airline analogy, actors have misused the airline system for all kinds of things, hijackings, terrorist attacks.
Sure.
And therein lies the problem with the work that you've been entrusted with, in that it only takes one big attack to then have all these incredible ripple effects.
But I don't think that those are necessarily in conflict. We are doing everything we can to work with American companies to reduce the risk that they face from attacks that are coming from hostile nations, from malicious criminal organizations. And that is our work every single day. We can do that at the same time that we are sharing information in a global environment to make sure that the internet stays safe, reliable, and is a common good for people around the world. It doesn't stop us from being clear-eyed about where those threats are coming from. It doesn't stop us from needing to focus on preventing those threats from being realized and working to kind of build resilience in domestic infrastructure so that we don't face catastrophic attacks. But we can do that in a world in which we are sharing information openly to reduce the broader prevalence of cybersecurity incidents.
So we haven't really talked about physical infrastructure yet. And another thing that I worry about, I worry a lot, as you can see, the semiconductor supply chain seems to me very heavily concentrated on, supplies from Taiwan, which in turn relies on, ASML. But there's a very clear sort of supply chain route that I think, keeps these lights on. And when it's that clear, it's that much easier to target. How much do you worry about that, and what kinds of things is government doing to make sure that it's not too vulnerable?
Yeah, so I think that is let's say a blessing and a curse. So on the one hand, if they're very clear, those kind of supply chains where you have concentrated dependence in one spot, it allows us to focus efforts in terms of resilience planning and risk management efforts. And obviously, there's a lot of work underway as the country looks at that. There's efforts we have to look to see how do we improve our diversity of supply chain. The CHIPS Act that was passed, looking to move more chip manufacturing inside the United States, is obviously a key element of that. But I am actually a bit more concerned about the concentrated dependencies that may not be as visible, that we may not know about in advance.
Such as?
Well, I think we saw a lot of those during the pandemic. Where we did not realize that critical supplies were not made here, and we were going to be at the potential mercy of other countries who needed to hoard that same exact equipment or materials for their own purposes. So I think one of the things that we do as an organization, as we work with industry, is try to identify those key concentrated dependence points between critical infrastructure so that we can apply risk management to try to make sure that we could build resilience into our systems, because we don't want to find out about those concentrated dependence points when we're in the midst of a crisis like we did during COVID. We should be identifying those now, managing those risks now, so if there ever was an incident, we're just much better prepared for it.
So we're at the UN this week. I know you only just came in last night, but what is your sense of takeaways from this week's discussions on AI, for example? Does it make you more hopeful about the way in which the world can wield this new power? Or does it worry you that we're relying on voluntary commitments?
I think, as Ambassador Fick said, voluntary commitments are the first step. Now, I come from an organization that is not in the regulatory business for the most part. We are really a voluntary organization that is designed to work with industry to build stronger cyber and physical security and resilience in our critical infrastructure. And so we have a long history of getting positive security outcomes from working with industry in a voluntary way. That may not be enough. I think time will tell about the degree of compliance with the voluntary commitments that those companies made. But more importantly, particularly in the AI space, those companies don't have complete and total control of all AI models. And I think we are concerned that there will be open source models that will be as powerful and certainly more powerful than the ones that exist today, that will come online over the next several years, that will put tremendous capability in the hands of good actors and bad. And we are going to have to, as a world, grapple with the fact that these tools are not controlled by either a small group of companies or governments, and that they may be available to any user around the world to use for positive and illicit purposes. And so while I think the voluntary commitments are a good start, we are going to need to identify other tools and other solutions that manage risks that we cannot control through either regulation or coercion or kind of voluntary work with industry.
At our magazine, Foreign Policy, we think about deterrence all the time in a variety of ways. And I've long been curious about why Russia hasn't successfully, or maybe it has, tell us, managed to attack the United States on cyber. Has it tried and it failed? Have there been any successful attempts at a smaller scale? Or were Russia's capabilities not that good? Or have you deterred them?
And I would probably argue that it's a combination of a variety of those factors. I would say that Russia's early work during the Ukrainian conflict was obviously focused there. And they were putting a lot of capability and targeting into against the Ukrainian government. I think as that conflict did not go as planned for them, they had to put more energy and focus into sustaining their efforts in Ukraine and less globally. I think we had talked publicly as a government in March of 2022 about threats that we were seeing from Russia against U.S. critical infrastructure, but I think a combination of deterrence, a combination of work that we had done to better prepare the country. CISA had kind of spearheaded a Shields Up campaign to make sure that U.S. critical infrastructure was just better prepared for potential Russian retaliation. And Russian capabilities may not have been aligned at that time to achieve those goals. And then finally, I think Russia may have realized that that would maybe not have achieved their aims. Lashing out at the United States may have made us be more involved in the conflict, not less. So I think I'm not here to kind of get into the psychology of Vladimir Putin. There's a lot of people who try, and I'm not sure anyone has cracked the code on that perfectly yet. But I think that the work that we are doing is designed to make that harder, and hopefully we have been successful.
Let me see if I can take one audience question. I see a hand over there. So you were very quick to put your hand up. We'll just get a mic to you, sir. This is also being live streamed.
Okay. Well, Srikant Nadamuni from India. We've heard of the existential threat of AI, and then we're talking about cyber threats of AI as well. And there's talk of us coming together to address that as a League of Nations. How do you see this play out? I mean, we have seen the nuclear non-proliferation treaties and so on in the past, but there you had materials to check, verify, and so on. Here it's completely digital. Do you see parallels there? How do you see this play out? How do we come together on both these threats?
It's a great question.
Yeah, I think it is a great question, and I think it really highlights the challenge of this problem, and kind of why I highlighted earlier why I think in some respects this is going to be a very difficult problem for governments to control, because increasingly as tools advance, as capabilities advance, compute power improves, these tools will be in the hands of people. You'll be able to develop these capabilities outside of any government control. Already today, you can go on Hugging Face, which is an open source repository for AI tools, and download one yourself and play with it, develop it, outside of anyone's control. And I think putting that, using the nuclear phrase, putting that genie back in the bottle is just probably not possible completely at this point. So it's about exercising control where we can to the maximum extent possible, as Ambassador Fick talked about. How do we do this collaboratively? How do we have similar examinations of this? How do we put in place codes of practice and standards that we can share across like-minded countries? And then how do we come together to address those risks that we just cannot manage because they're going to be in the hands of anyone, too broad an audience and too easily shared and too easily adapted? I don't think that we have an answer today. It's going to require a lot of creativity. And I think it's one of the reasons why we've come to those large companies who are developing those models today, because they have the expertise to understand what it takes to both develop those. They have the best experience in terms of working with them, and they may have innovative ideas on how we can manage some of these risks that government just doesn't quite know yet.
A very quick final question. We've discussed China and Russia, obviously the US. What are the other 2, 3, or 4 countries that strike you as having impressive cyber capabilities or AI capabilities that we don't always talk about?
Sure. I mean, I think that there's a variety of countries that we work with that are that have top tier cybersecurity skills and capabilities, and a lot of those are kind of our close partners in the West, whether it's countries like the UK and Canada and Australia, Israel, which has a pretty incredible technology industry, that has very sophisticated cybersecurity tools and companies working in that space. A lot of venture capital money flowing to them because of that, but other ones as well. Countries like Singapore in Asia that we collaborate with very closely, and I think that's good. We want more companies and countries involved in cybersecurity because this is a challenging space. It is one where no government has all the answers and can do this work alone. It's why we spend so much of our time building these relationships, both with industry and both with other countries around the world, because this is going to take a true kind of collective defense, given the scale of the threats that we face today.
Thank you for doing what you do. Brandon Wales, real pleasure.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Great to have you.
And now, please welcome to the stage Dr. Caroline King, the Global Head of Government Affairs and Business Development at SAP, Anne-Marie Engtoft Larsen, the Tech Ambassador of Denmark, and Hoden Omar, Senior Analyst at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. This panel on AI for a Sustainable Future will be moderated by Maggie Lake, veteran journalist and founder of Maggie Lake Media.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to dive right in. We can see that there's a huge amount of interest in this. Just a reminder throughout the day, if you would like to submit a question from the audience, there are these cards that were on your seat. They're laying around. Scan the QR code and submit them that way. We won't have to worry about the mic situation. So that is your PSA as we get started. So just want to jump right in. Super excited to have this conversation with these three amazing women who are all working on this. As we've heard, AI is something that has exploded into our lives. We're all using it. We're touching it. And as Ambassador Fick said, there is a lot of promise, but also a lot of peril. So we want to sort of to get into that a little bit and talk about what that means in reference to the sustainability goals. And Caroline, if you could sort of set the scene for us, what does this look like from your perspective when we're talking about sustainability?
Maybe not so new. So I work for SAP. For those of you who don't know it, we're the last big European software player and the world leader in business software. About, depending on what business magazine you read, about 77 to 80% of the world's economy runs on some kind of SAP system. So imagine what would happen if we had in multiple servers, some sort of cyber attack. We've been in the AI business more than 10 years because of machine learning. So we've seen a progression from the analytics to the predictive capacity of these kinds of technologies, and now we're in this disruptive, creative, generative AI business. But it's, for us, not really new. It's an integration of a new, disruptive, interesting technology with enormous potential for speed and scalability into our existing applications. So maybe it's a bit of an unfair advantage for a company like SAP because we're already, we have a lot of data. We have probably, as a tech company, the world's biggest pool of customer data. We can use that and generate new applications using AI technology. So we're doing everything from working on token certification for the distribution of hydrogen so that you can trace the origin of the hydrogen based on all of the ESG criteria from origin to delivery point. We are working with rural sourcing management in agriculture to, of course, the classic kind of LE, large enterprise business that SAP is known for, the first iFactory that BMW is running, to monitor its entire supply chain from start to finish is also running on SAP, and that was a big new announcement for us as well. So from the very, very small to the very, very large, it's technology that is exciting for an SAP as well, but where we see more potential than risk.
Yeah, and we had AI come up, I think, in all of the panels I did yesterday, from, as you say, small doctors in Rwanda using it to scan retinas because they don't have enough people. So we've seen these examples come up. But you said something that I think is probably very top of mind for you, Ambassador, and that is the speed with which this is happening. And I think that's where the sort of peril or the worry comes in. How can you optimize all of the potential, but also keep in mind that there is this flip side? How are you thinking about that from a governmental point of view?
First of all, if I may Carol said many things that are very dear to me. One, that SAP is the last big software play in Europe. It certainly won't be. I think many innovations are about to come, but we can take that on a different note. So this question around speed, to me, this feels like the AI revolution is the first time where this conversation about exponentiality, that things are going so fast that even the sort of the non-trained, non-technical human eye can really not grasp the implications of it. I actually think that's true with this. And so having seen it's 9 months ago since ChatGPT came out now. If any of you saw the DALL-E that came out yesterday, what they now can do with image generation, that is exponential. Yeah. I was on a breakfast just another room this morning on biosecurity. It is exponential what this will do on both the risk and opportunity sides in the health space. And so right now we have this powerful technology, and I think it's reductionist to say, is it either good or bad? Is it mainly, am I optimistic about the opportunities? Sure. If I wouldn't, I would be a terrible representative for my government. I think most countries right now are trying to figure out how do we take this powerful tool and harness it for the good of our innovation, our economy, humanity, sustainability. And at the same time, I'm paid to be concerned. That's what diplomats do. And so there are huge risks associated with this. And on this question of, I think ITU came out with a report early this year that 79% of the SDGs can actually be advanced with artificial intelligence. We hear, I probably heard the word potential of AI and SDGs 1,000 times this week. I think it's important that we haven't fully grasp what does that look like. Yeah. Sustainability, whether it's developmental challenges, is a complex political economic affair. It's not a problem that just requires a technical solution. Poverty and hunger, huge inequalities in access to healthcare and education, they're not technical problems, they're political problems, economic problems. They are long-standing issues of a world that's been formed in the century past us. And so now we're going to use the technologies of this century to figure out how do we take them in. And so it's the technical innovation, but it is also the political innovation.
Yeah, which is why we will inevitably be talking about public-private partnership, right? Some of this is actually also a learning curve, an education curve. Hodan, we were speaking before. You're based in D.C. The news feed, when we're talking about AI, tends to be dominated by, are our kids using it to cheat? And, the more pedestrian things that are of great concern to us, I'm sure. But how are you seeing this play out from your perspective? And what's the conversation, the policy conversation that you're trying to have?
That's a great question, because I think that there is an incredible focus on ensuring that we don't get this wrong. And I think that's very important. But the question of how do we get this right is, I think, where more of the conversation needs to happen. If we want to see AI used for the public good, if we want to see it used for to kind of support the SDGs, there actually do need to be policies put in place to ensure that happens. And I also kind of want to ground this conversation in some kind of concrete example so that we all know exactly how AI can support some of those SDGs. One example that I've seen is in the early days of the pandemic, how AI can actually support quelling, understanding where disease is spreading and helping to quell that. So Facebook shared or made publicly available to certain researchers anonymized versions of human mobility data. My phone knows where I go in real time in a sort of granular and concrete way. And if researchers want to know where is disease spreading, the historical resources that they use, things like census data or even call detail records, are not as kind of granular as they need to be. And so we actually need access to kind of location-based service data, which is typically held by the private sector, companies like Facebook, telephone companies as well, like Orange, for example. And if we want to have access to that data, we do need, as you say, to do these sort of public-private partnerships, because we have to understand, I think policymakers need to understand that there are so many barriers that these companies face. If we want to get Facebook to share that data, they have to pay to ensure that it's anonymized. They have to shoulder those privacy risks. They have to make the decision of which researchers do I share it with? Which SDGs am I trying to solve? And they can't do that by themselves. And so there's a real need for policy to kind of put those guardrails in place. And another example I wanted to highlight was actually what the World Food Program is doing with their, it's called the AHEAD program, the Autonomous Humanitarian Emergency Aid Devices program, which is to say when we want to provide food and much needed resources to people who are in incredibly besieged regions, there is a lot of risk on humanitarian workers. And how can we kind of provide that through these autonomous devices? Actually, airdrops are much more resource heavy than people think. And so they're using AI-enabled robots to kind of provide that. And I think that's another great example to kind of make it a little bit more concrete.
Yeah, and I think these tangible examples are really important because we have to lock into what are we talking about to have a sensible conversation about what a public-private partnership looks like. Caroline, I saw you shaking your head. How at SAP are you thinking about the issue of public-private partnerships?
I mentioned the green token that we're scheme. This is an intrapreneurship. That's an interesting example for several reasons, because it's a solution that was developed within SAP, within our own employee community, and has now, we've partnered now with the German government. SAP is a German company, so that's our first natural partner to first, with regard to Brazil, to look at how we can certify hydrogen deliveries in many different countries. So that's that kind of awareness raising, the support from a government side, education, skilling, funding. We had a session last week here in New York on an interesting agricultural harvest monitoring project that, of course, has relevance in Ukraine right now, and that we've been talking to government partners about how this could be financed so that the Ukrainians could use it. It's a exponentially evolving technology, so we do have to work together hand in hand, the public-private sector, to understand the potential and, of course, to create the level playing field that we need, as we do with all technologies. We've seen a lot of increase in protectionism. I would say it's even more concern for us than the geopolitical conflict and trade conflicts we've had. It's a longer standing issue that's really creating barriers to cross-border data flows, which then has an impact on the growth of our interdependent global digital economy, which we need to achieve growth goals and to become not only sustainable, but to continue to maintain this scope of and trajectory of growth of many of these emerging economies. That patchwork regulation that we're seeing is really a big concern for us. So on that score as well, we need to work with the public sector so they understand what the risks are. We've seen it, we've had this conversation many years, open source, cloud, concerns about cyber. This is for us just another step and another issue to discuss openly and not be afraid to address in public dialogue. So,
yeah, that's a great point. And Ambassador, I know you've been engaged in meetings all week. We are talking about a technology that knows no borders in a global economy that's interconnected, that's moving at lightning speed, and yet that's against the backdrop of talk of regionalization, reshoring, a multipolar world or bifurcated world. Those two things seem incredibly at odds.
They are. I think that's the short answer is they are. And so this unprecedented, what is a multi-stakeholder public-private partnership collaboration in this space? When we all come home and have a good night's sleep after this UNGA week, I think we really got to put sort of collective mind thinking, what does that look like? Sort of drawing historically 250 years ago, the spinning jenny was sort of the piece of machinery that started the Industrial Revolution, the textile industry. It was created so that only small hands could operate it. So they used children for the first 3 decades. And then later on, government sort of caught on and said, probably that's not conducive. And so we did labor laws. 150 years ago, Carl Benz's wife, Berta, took the first car on a trip with her son. At that time, the combustion engine was actually as far advanced as the electric vehicle engine. For reasons unknown, we didn't collaborate between government and technologists at the time. And now with 1 billion cars and the vast majority of them are not electrical vehicles, we have huge impact on the climate. And so we can't wait 30 years, as we did with the labor laws, to not have, child labor. We can't wait 150 years for someone to say, maybe we should do electrical vehicles with more than 1 billion cars polluting the planet. With AI, it's like we gotta sort of ride a horse while imagining the car at the same time.
Yeah.
We also got to do it in a way that we overcome. I find there to be a sort of a trust crisis.
Yeah.
For good reasons. I mean, we've in Europe, we just come up with the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, which has been a response to a lack of trust between big tech companies and governments. That the responsibility given to them and harnessed by them from incredible technology also had a negative impact on our democracy and human rights. And so how do we overcome a trust issue? Because there are fundamentally different interests.
Yes.
Right now, governments, we have to mitigate between how do we harness the innovation power for our economies in a multipolar world where it turns out that Francis Fukuyama was not right. We're not all going towards more democracy. Turns out there are states that want a different type of governance system, a different type of being in the world. We want to win the competition about designing the technologies and the value systems behind them. At the same time, we want to set guardrails. The EU AI Act is a great example of that. Is that going to hinder innovation? I don't hope so. We're trying to think that we can actually do innovation based on regulation. But some would disagree with me. Some would say now you're putting more strains on an industry that just needs to be unleashed. The letter that came out, should we put a 6-month moratorium, just all go home, take a long vacation, and then come back in 6 months and have a better idea of what we don't want to do with AI? What if our adversaries are not doing that? So it is an incredibly complex situation. I think it's important when we go into these conversations about public-private partnership. It is not simply that companies are good at doing a technology and we can take a little bit of the risk. And so there is sort of an unprecedented part to this. There's a whole question of civil society and having them at the table to help shed light on some of the, I think, really potential downsides of this. I did not come up with any great answer there.
No, but you highlighted, I think, an incredibly important piece of this, which is being, I don't even think proactive is the right word, right? It's leaping in to have this extremely complex conversation in real time, right? It's like a workshop in real time that has to happen as opposed to being reactive, which is what governments are. We joke in the U.S., no offense to anyone who may be in here, but we're still working on regulations for the internet.
Yeah.
So we have got to think of a new way, which is what you hear across the board, both in private and public, but it's got to happen immediately. Throw into the mix of the trust crisis young people. We have, FP just did a virtual dialogue on defending democracy, and we had representation from young people who are checking out of all systems. They want this conversation that you just described to happen immediately because it's their future. Hodan, we discussed this. We were talking about this very issue right before we came in. How do we ensure that AI benefits are equitable in terms of economic development? You talked about access to data. This is incredibly important. We went through the internet where that was gated and moated in the private sector. How important is it to sort of have a really frank conversation about that up front?
I like that you brought up data because I think as we have this conversation about AI, it's important to think about the feeders into AI, one of which is data and one of which is compute. And to think about how do we ensure that AI is equitable, it's really important to think about, are we ensuring that the data is inclusive? Are we ensuring that everybody is represented in the data? This idea of not having invisible people in data. We've written some reports at the Center for Data Innovation at ITIF specifically on this point. And also thinking about access to compute, which I think is a conversation is not often had or not had enough, which is to say these, to really do forefront AI, at this point you need really big amounts of compute. And that is concentrated in the private sector and concentrated in certain companies. And so if we want to ensure that, especially if we want to ensure that AI is being developed towards the SDG goals, we can't think that the private sector is going to be fully incentivized to do that. That's not to say that they don't do things towards that. but the public sector has to have access to ensure that. So we have to ensure that academic researchers have access to the tools that they need to do AI for climate and AI for energy and AI for humanitarian purposes. I will say that I actually think that one of the initiatives in the United States, which is called the National AI Research Resource, which is a really ambitious project to spread compute access across the entire country, really think deeply about what parts of the country have access, where are the compute resources at which universities are they at? Can we ensure that historically black communities and universities have access to this? I think that is a real way to think about it, and I actually know that the EU is also doing something where it's spreading access to its compute resources across the EU. So I think, how can we ensure that the feeders of AI are equitable?
Yeah, and the compute power bringing that up is essential. Anne-Marie, we know you have to catch a flight. We're going to let you run off stage because you have too much good work to do. So we appreciate it. We appreciate all the thoughts, and we hope you'll continue this conversation with us.
And before I leave, can I just do one last
Please.
comment? My last answer got a little, not enough coffee in too long of a week. I do want to say that between what keeps me optimistic on this is, first of all, these type of conversations that we actually bring, together sort of diverse voices, different interests and backgrounds, tech diplomats, governments actually now having people, Eileen Donahoe, the U.S. new digital envoy for digital freedom. Nate Fick was here on stage. Lots of, Henri, I believe, is here too, the French tech ambassador. Governments are really trying to do the work. The Freedom Online Coalition celebrated its 10 years anniversary yesterday, really trying to get the multi-stakeholder model. In the EU, the reason why sometimes legislation goes a little slow, because we try to be inclusive. We actually do, SAP is part of that conversation too. We are not going to come with a perfect multilateral body to solve all of this. We're going to have different pieces and try to make them sort of patch them together. And I think the UNGA Week is a part of that. At the UNICEF Venture event a few days ago, young innovators, to exactly the point you're speaking about, how do we harness the drive for using innovation to solve things, move fast and solve things. And so lots of challenges. The fragmented geopolitical environment that we're in is probably not going to change when we meet in a year from now. But I do find that there is a lot of meaningful and committed efforts to actually try and do the right thing. So I am sorry I got to catch a flight to Iceland now. But it's been a pleasure to be here.
And we appreciate all of the people that put in those posts who are having these important conversations and doing that hard work. Thank you. Thank you. We've got a bit more time left, so we're going to take advantage of that. Caroline, what are you hearing from your customers? We talked about the speed with which this is happening. A lot of companies, they are just sort of running and grabbing because they know they have to. They've been told if you don't embed AI in your business, you will die. What are you hearing from them, and how much of it is an education that you're doing with your clients in terms of how to think about this?
Yeah, definitely. That's part of the public-private partnership as well. So I think there's certainly a lot of concern about meeting ESG requirements, and the potential for technology, whether it's AI or other analytical tools, to support that is really enormous. There's a lot of interest and pressure too. In Germany, we have a new Lieferkettengesetz, the obligation within the supply chain, along the entire supply chain, to maintain SDG goals, social, human rights, and that reporting requirement has a lot of customers nervous. That's just a German example, and that will also be translated to the EU level. So it's a risk, but also an opportunity because they do understand that they, at least from our side, for those who are already customers, it's embedded in the applications. It's maybe not as heavy a lift as it might be for others. But definitely there's enormous interest and enormous pressure within Europe. I would say the regulatory landscape too, if I may come back to that, the interaction, SAP has been involved on the AI ethics side very early on. I think we were the first technology company in Europe to get proactively engaged because we do have all this data and because we do run these technology applications across 28 business sectors. that expertise is really something that the customers are interested in. There's a lot of active exchange between us and our customers, but also across the public sector. And probably, Anne-Marie's gone, but I would imagine that we will be engaging, there'll be a more active kind of business coalition within Europe as well around the AI topic to bring all of the actors together. It's not just an LE like SAP that has access to all this data. There's a lot of open data out there, and we're cooperating with our partners on both sides also to make this more accessible. And of course, there are also, I did want to respond to her on that. She asked me, but I met her yesterday, and we had a little short conversation about who are the European innovators. Of course, there are fantastic startups and new ventures across the European space. I don't want to be left leaving the impression that we're not interested in any of that. No, my God, we wouldn't be able to move ahead without those partnerships, and we've done some investment in some interesting innovators, Aleph Alpha in Germany, for example, to support movement and development on the AI side.
Oh, the business journalist in me would be asking about acquisitions that are planned, but I will leave that. But it does bring up a great point, Hodan. If done right, this can unleash an enormous amount of innovation that really has the potential to move the needle. What we hear all the time in terms of barriers for reaching the sustainability goals, rather, is access and affordability. And if done right, AI can really blow that open.
Yeah, that's true, especially with these sort of open source models. And I mean, even also for the consumer themselves, I mean, being able to use ChatGPT to draft answers to these questions, if I'd have known them beforehand, it's like, it does make things more affordable. And I think when things are more affordable, people can naturally innovate better and more quickly.
We did not use ChatGPT, by the way, to formulate this discussion, in case any of you were wondering about that. What would you like to see from policymakers, Hodan? Because you are, as I said before, you're based in D.C. What message would you give them?
I think it's moving from, which is what they want to, right? Like moving from potential to actual concrete applications of this technology, seeing adoption of this, not only in the places that are kind of for SDGs, but more broadly. If we believe that it's good for society, we believe that it's good for the economy, let's ensure that it's, that the guardrails exist, but also that we are working to actually ensure that it's adopted. That's what and so I'd like to see policymakers focus more on that side of the coin of, I want to see this adopted in my country, and this is what I'm going to do to ensure that happens.
Yeah, Caroline, last thoughts from you. What's your message, and how do we make sure that we're moving forward and not let fear slow it down so much that we lose this opportunity?
I can only echo what Hodan has just said. It really is important to take a risk-based approach to AI that doesn't set up barriers that prohibit the innovation from the get-go, but that actually allow that innovation to take place and just put those guardrails in place. Harmonization of international standards has been a long-standing issue and concern, and with AI, it's just added another layer. And disclosure frameworks is also coherent disclosure frameworks, or what kind of data. We have an advantage in SAP. We're already GDPR compliant. That's a nice, painful but good exercise we went through in Europe. And of course, that means that we can offer customers data privacy, the gold standard in data privacy. But having kind of a harmonization on those disclosure frameworks globally would be obviously key to the development of the sector altogether.
Well, this was a fantastic conversation. Thank you both so much, and of course, the ambassador. Thank you all.
Next, Kevin Wolf, partner at Aiken Gump Strauss Hauer & Field, joins our program for a conversation on semiconductors and the global race to innovate with FP's Allison Carlson.
He was
there, and so was the landscape was pretty incredible. So, you know, that's definitely a night to remember.
World. So thank you for taking. Can you hear me? Okay, great. I was just saying thank you for joining us. And to those online, we're really glad that you're here and carving out some time in what we know is a very, very busy week. I'd like to also encourage everyone in the room, but also online, to submit questions. We want this to be as engaging and interactive as possible. I have the pleasure to be with Kevin Wolf right now, and we're going to dive into a topic that is, you know, I think at the forefront of a lot of people's minds, and it certainly wasn't a couple years ago, and that's related to semiconductors. You know, I think certainly semiconductors have become the lifeblood of, you know, a lot of technology development and deployment, and are absolutely essential to competitiveness in AI, quantum computing, and not only that, but essential to, you know, renewable energy, electronics and commercial electronics, and demand for semiconductors is absolutely skyrocketing. And I think all of us can relate to during the pandemic and the experience of that supply chain crunch that was happening. And, you know, the demand that we anticipate for semiconductors, for clean energy technologies, and, you know, other military applications and other applications going forward is immense. And the competition over them is increasingly fierce, and investment is needed. And so you are an expert on these issues and are really eager to hear from you and also the audience. And so as we go through the discussion today, if you have questions, please submit them. There's a QR code on, you know, on the cards on your chairs, but also those online, you can submit your questions as well. And my colleague Claire here will be sharing those with us. But if I can just turn to you to set the stage a little bit. You know, we are seeing this increasing demand, and there are the projections from the IEA and otherwise. How are you seeing this intensifying competition globally and hunger for computing power, you know, impacting the sector and impacting the market? What are some of the key trends that you're seeing?
Sure. So to put the demand and the issues you put into context for what I'm an expert in, all those reasons create both national security and economic security objectives. And U.S. law and policy is trying to adapt to that. It's no longer just business for the sake of business. On the economic security issue is why you have the CHIPS Act, which is trying to bring subsidies back to the U.S. to create incentives for more domestic manufacturing of advanced node semiconductors and the education and all the inputs into it. Because of the criticality to the functioning of the economy. And where I'm the expert is what sometimes often gets blended and confused with that in the commentary and the media, which is the national security concerns with respect to that. And going to your opening statement about this being a topic that nobody paid any attention to, that's been pretty much my whole life. I've been I'm an export control expert. I'm an expert at the rules that govern the movement of commodity software and technology to accomplish national security and foreign policy objectives. And during the Cold War, these rules existed to achieve broader strategic objectives in order to contain and constrain the Soviet Union and the East Bloc. So you couldn't send a washing machine to East Germany, and telecommunications generally were prohibited for the Soviet Union and the embargoed countries. And then when I came of age in the early 90s in this area, everything shifted to a focus on nonproliferation. That is, the types of items that have some identifiable direct or clear relationship to the production, development, or operation of weapons of mass destruction or conventional weapons. And so for most of my career, when nobody like you were paying attention and you weren't inviting me to events like this, that was what the rules governed. The U.S. and its allies maintained a coherent set of list of items that they agreed each year had some identifiable relationship to those objectives. And that was export controls, and that's how national security was defined. What started happening with respect to China is the issue regarding what national security means has expanded. Issues pertaining to fundamentally the civil military fusion policy of the government of China of requiring commercial applications, such as semiconductors, to benefit the modernization of the Chinese military. You have the issue of using strategic economic dominance objectives in order to artificially subsidize the development of key things such as semiconductors in order to achieve advantages over the United States to interfere with those economic security objectives that you mentioned. And then on the human rights side, you have the use of modern electronics, semiconductors, facial recognition, et cetera, to engage in systemic and widespread human rights abuses. With mass surveillance and issues involving the Uyghurs. And so the old system of regulating the flow of commercial items and dual-use items that had some relevance didn't really fit this evolving national security threat that is China. And then what happened is, so there was lots of discussions about this in 2017 and 18, very bipartisan discussion with Congress expanding the authority for the administration to both regulate inbound and outbound transfers of commercial items to achieve these broader than classical national security objectives. And then with Russia's continued invasion of Ukraine, for the first time really since the end of the Cold War, the U.S. and the allies came together to impose strategic controls outside the scope of that classical national security objective in order to have an impact on Russia's capability to keep its war machine running and shutting off the flow of commercial semiconductors as a primary objective. And then in September of 2022, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, laid out for the first time the coherent articulation of the national security, not economic protectionism, not mercantilism, as most people confuse it, but economic security objectives with regulating the flow of the inputs that are needed to make advanced node semiconductors, supercomputers, AI, and semiconductor production equipment. And so all things involving advanced node semiconductors, the production equipment to make them with respect to their relevance to AI and quantum, which are foundational technologies, which are enabling technologies to modernize the Chinese military, that became the national security threat. And so a lot of people are sort of looking at things like the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act and broader economic objectives and conflating them with the national security objectives of the regulations that came about primarily in October of last year, which basically aimed at cutting off all the inputs, whether U.S. or foreign, involving U.S. services or U.S. origin items into those four things: advanced node semiconductors, production equipment, GPUs for AI, and supercomputers. And so what we're at is really a foundational shift in what constitutes national security, which inevitably goes into what are inherently commercial items. Now, the dilemma, the difficulty for an administration, and I'll finish up here, is when you start imposing controls unilaterally, because right now these are only actions by the U.S. There's some small participation by Japan, and it's critical and important. I don't want to minimize it. And the Netherlands with respect to some kinds of production equipment for advanced node semiconductors. History has shown, and I speak as someone who's been doing this a long time, that inevitably when a country goes it alone and imposes controls, inevitably they become ineffective. Inevitably, they become counterproductive. Inevitably, whoever you're trying to keep something from figures out another way to get it. They can get it legally from the allies or produce it themselves. Now, they're absolutely effective, and I don't want to in any way minimize the national security threat issue that I described. It's very real. My only point is, and it's actually directly relevant to your front page, this is like you timed it for, the alliances that matter now. The old alliances with respect to export controls are based upon a classical, immediate post-Cold War non-proliferation way of thinking about the role of controls. And the thing that I advocate is in order to make this new vision of national security, this new issues involving national security, fundamentally with respect to China and Russia, but it's not limited there, but fundamentally China and Russia, is there must be a new way of thinking about the purpose of export controls that is plurilateral, a smaller group of close allies with common values with respect to common security threats that see things more broadly than has traditionally been the case, and also factor in human rights objectives, which don't now exist with respect to any of the multilateral regimes. And so we're in this completely messy period of what the scope and role and purpose of export controls in, and industry having to adjust, and collateral impacts and discoveries about what's working and what's not. So this is actually really the most exciting time to be in this field because of the complexity and also because of the seriousness of it all. And I'm a true believer in the scope and purpose and role of these export controls. And to get at the issues that you're driving, my sort of fundamental pitch is clear articulation of a national security, not economic objective, and incorporation and adoption by the allies of the authorities and the policies to accomplish the same thing. Anyway, that's my opening summary. How's that?
It's great, and I appreciate it. I do have a couple questions about it, however. So I understand what you're saying, and there is a national security objective, but also an economic imperative for countries, blocs to invest in the strategic sector for economic development and growth, and also to mitigate what are real and some perceived risks related to that. And so we have been seeing, investments in the CHIPS Act, as you noted, also the European CHIPS Act, and this proliferation of policy and investment to that end. And so, some have called it industrial policy, and that is more focused on an economic objective. But as you're describing national security imperatives, they are inextricably linked. And how are you building alliances and the partnerships that are necessary to implement the export controls that you just described when there are, potentially competing objectives here, because they are inextricably linked? And when you're talking about policymakers, they need to and are focused on economic development.
Absolutely. Great way to put it. That's exactly what I said. When the two start blending together, when you start getting into what are inherently commercial items, which are the types of semiconductors that you're referring to, it gets very difficult to tease out what is a national security versus what is an economic objective. And if you're an ally and you're looking abroad into the United States and you see the CHIPS Act and you see the export controls in your mind, they all blend together. Obviously, they overlap. But the thing that is missed is that you can't export control your way into a growth economy with respect to more advanced production in the United States. And that's what the CHIPS Act and other similar industrial policy efforts, which are economic focused, of course, but have the national security benefits that the U.S. government is focusing. The export control part is meant at preventing the foundational technologies for indigenous development or production in the country of concern, which is in China, in the country of concern, which is in Russia. And the way you get allies on board is, first, you have to convince them to at least change their laws, their domestic laws, to give their export control agencies even the authority to do something new and novel and non-classical outside the non-proliferation. The laws of the Allies, with very few exceptions, are baked into a worldview that was created in 1996. The U.S. is fundamentally different as a result of the legislation from 2017 and then finally finished in 2018, there's extraordinary discretion for broader than classical controls for national security reasons. The way you do it, the way the U.S. government is working on doing it and needs to keep doing it, is to convince the allies of common security threats and that it's a common security issue. It's not meant to give economic benefit just to U.S. companies for the sake of economic benefit for U.S. companies. That perception, unfortunately, is out there a lot. And I try to do what I can to disabuse it, and the U.S. government needs to do what it does to disabuse it even more so. And then after they give themselves the authorities to even do something differently, that's where evidence and advocacy and persuasion about what the underlying threat is. And the difficulty in it for the U.S. government is that in the old way of doing things, which still exists, by the way, non-proliferation is just as important as it always was, you can look at a missile and you can look at the civil components that are used to make the missile and say, let's control that. That's obvious and everybody understands it. To try to regulate, to say that there's a threat with respect to the modernization of the Chinese military, and you look at the modeling systems in order to make the systems and the computers to do the modeling and the types of chips that are needed to make the computers to do the modeling and the tools to make the chips to do the computers to do the modeling and the U.S. person support, which is now prohibited, in order to keep the tools running to make the chips, in order to do the computers to do the modeling to make the missile. That's a much harder argument. And I'm not making fun of it. I'm saying it's very serious. It's just much harder to explain than let's allies all come together and control the types of semiconductors that have radiation-hardened properties or temperature or vibration properties that are relevant to making a missile work. And inevitably, what we're talking about here are the very same chips that go into laptops and cell phones. And so it's really, really difficult to tease out that objective, and that's what's making the U.S. government's job is harder, which is all the more reason why they need to keep doing what they're doing in order to make this eventually both an effective and not counterproductive effort.
Well, and also when a lot of the discussions are couched or characterized in a context of nearshoring, friendshoring, which is inherently implying alliances, but it's also often an economic argument that's being made. And I think also what you're pointing to is the globalized nature and vast interconnectedness of that supply chain. And so the implementation of those controls, I would imagine, be incredibly challenging, but then also to make the argument and have those allies and partners come along for the security objectives as opposed to or in addition to the economic objectives.
Absolutely, because to go along with what I'm describing and what the U.S. government is doing, inevitably commercial companies in the U.S. and allied countries will lose money because they will lose access to markets. They will lose opportunities in China. And so that's actually all of export controls have that cost because they exist to achieve national security objectives and foreign policy objectives that are beyond. If it was only economics that was the driver, there would be no export controls. Sell anything to anybody for any reason to make as much money as you can. So you're always going to be imposing a cost. The key is to be able to convince people that the cost is worth it for the broader common security objectives. But you don't have to always and only make it about the cost. There are other things, for example, the U.S. government could do in order to basically dovetail with those objectives, create more opportunities for access to the U.S. economy by the allies, reduce unnecessary barriers on trade by and among between the close allies, whether they're imposed through export control systems or tariffs or other things, open up opportunities for foreign nationals to be able to get visas more quickly and easily in these high-tech sectors of common interest, make it easier for and simpler for direct investment by and among between these countries. And so even though it has a national security objective, there are things that can be done to reduce the sting of the fringe shoring in order to accomplish the same objectives, both on the economic side and the national security side.
Are there risks in implementation of market fragmentation?
Well, inevitably, there's going to be market fragmentation because the whole point is to cut off indigenous capabilities in China in these key sectors. And most of, actually all of the allies have their economies and sectors are completely interconnected. And so, yeah, absolutely. In fact, this is the phrase the administration uses. It's de-risking as opposed to decoupling. It's not about cutting off all access. It's not about tourism. It's not about cosmetics. It's not about tennis shoes. It's about the inputs to make the advanced node semiconductors that are the enabling technology needed to modernize the military. And in that sector, you're going to have fragmentation. And everything else, it doesn't have to be.
Sure, and I wonder, and we're out of time in just a few minutes, but my last question is, when you think about that, if it is inherently going to cause market fragmentation,
yes,
then play that forward. Then if there is increasing market fragmentation around the world, what does that mean for interoperability? What does that mean for infrastructure investment? What does that mean for connectivity around the world, especially in developing markets, for example, where infrastructure investment is an imperative. Digitalization is as well. So what are the implications of that fragmentation when you play it forward?
All national security objectives, when you're dealing with controls, inevitably will have a cost. And so the issue is all those other creative solutions not to have an impact on the global south, not to have unnecessary collateral impacts on interaction with their close allies, not to have interactions that are, impacts that are unnecessary with respect to the allies to fringe shore and work together and create new opportunities for markets outside the countries of concern in these technologies of sector, again, without a broader decoupling of every other area of technology which doesn't have this national security threat.
Fascinating.
I've got a longer version, too.
Affecting everything. We're out of time, but I appreciate you being with us here
Great. Happy
today.
to help.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Next, please welcome to the stage Teresa Hudson, Corporate Vice President of Technology for Fundamental Rights at Microsoft, Michael Phillips, Director of Technology, Strategy and Relationships at AARP, and Sally Radwan, the United Nations Environment Program Chief Digital Officer. This discussion on digital inclusion and underserved populations will be moderated by FP's Vice President of Research for FP Analytics, Dr. Maisha Alam.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to have this conversation with three experts who really are going to help us understand the connections between ensuring digital inclusion for all and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and why that matters and how we get there. Before I get started, just a couple of really quick reminders. We welcome audience questions, and so if you'd like to participate in the discussion, please feel free to submit your questions. If you are in the room, there's a double-sided card with a QR code that you can use. Let's dive right in. Thank you again for being here. And Michael, I'd love to start with you. You are at AARP, where you lead the work on technology and strategy and how to think about digital inclusion. So, as you know, we're here in New York during the UN General Assembly. The Sustainable Development Goals are, of course, very high on the agenda. Can you help our audience understand how is digital inclusion connected to the 2030 agenda, and what role does it play in the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals?
Yeah, and I think, first of all, thank you for having us here. We really appreciate it, Maisha, and thank you for all your work at FP in thinking about inclusion in the digital world in a different way. Of course, digital inclusion, the digital world undercuts all the SDGs, starting with the first three: ending poverty, ending hunger, health and welfare. You can see how people who aren't connected, who don't have access to the information, the essential resources, and all of the amazing innovation that's coming down the pipe, would be at a disadvantage, even a further disadvantage. We're seeing, here in developing nations as well as in the global South and other developing worlds, that as organizations and partnerships like Microsoft and their Airband initiative are bringing the infrastructure and affordability to communities, it opens up access, but then it raises additional barriers, such as skills, such as design, such as language barriers, and so forth, that also need to be addressed. The other way that I think we're seeing more and more digital inclusion is going to be important for meeting all of the 17 SDGs are in the underlying AI for Good programs that are being developed. Underserved populations, whether it's underserved for age or ethnicities, gender, or economic underserved communities, they're just not part of the data pools that are being used to create societal benefit in this amazing world. So we have to make sure that that everyone has access in order to be included in these. And I know Microsoft has. I'm probably stealing Teresa's thunder.
We talked ahead of time, so you did take my talking points.
So I apologize.
No, I'm totally kidding. Totally kidding.
Of course, AARP is not a technology organization, and we see every month new amazing ways that organizations like Microsoft are using the advanced models to address that.
Yeah, and that's a perfect place to pick up and continue the conversation. And there's a lot you touched on that I think we can unpack, and I'm looking forward to discussing the AI for Good, what this means in terms of who needs access the most and how do you sustain access and build confidence and ensure utilization of this technology. But I do want to pick up specifically, Teresa, with you about the Airband initiative. Microsoft is at the forefront of the innovation and implementation of this work, and really bringing access to people across the world, hundreds of millions of people across the world, and especially in Latin America and Africa. And let me ask you this. What have been some of the lessons learned and key factors that programs like the Airband initiative have brought for you? And, as you're establishing them within local communities, how are you thinking about scaling?
Yeah, and I think the way the Airband initiative has worked, which is basically it's our goal to extend meaningful connectivity around the world, and we have said we will extend with partners connectivity to 250 million people by the end of 2025, including 100 million in Africa. But of course, we don't do that by ourselves. And that's the really important lesson, I think. We have to work with partners. We have to work with partners who build the technology that extends connectivity. We have to work with partners who understand the local communities, to understand how do you serve the needs where you are going. So if we're going into Ghana and we are working with, the Hunger Project, we work with a local community center and center it in women who use the local community center. So I think it's the way, and then what we use what we have done to then advocate for change at scale. And so what that means, for example, what we did in the United States is we did this work with a lot of partners, while we used that to kind of prove the case to advocate, among others, with partners for significant infrastructure funding for connectivity. And so we think that's the way to go, because Microsoft by itself and even our internet partners and the NGOs we work with, they're not going to fund connectivity by themselves. We do need significant infrastructure funding for it.
Yeah, and this piece about building the infrastructure, having the funding and the financing to make that be sustainable, I think, is a really important point, and one where I think, Sally, I'd love to bring you into the conversation. In addition to your former role as an advisor to the Egyptian Minister for ICT, you've also worked across a range of multilaterals on developing ICT frameworks. And I'd love to hear from you, what do you see is the role of policy and regulation to creating those enabling environments? And what have you seen also to be some of the hurdles in terms of ensuring investments are being targeted and reaching where they need?
That's a great question, and thank you again for inviting me today. It's great to be here. So when I was growing up in Egypt about 30 years ago, there was this saying that in 10 years or so from then, if you don't know how to use a computer, you just don't belong in this world. You won't know how to survive. And that kind of turned out to be true to some extent, but fast forward 30 years and we're kind of saying the same thing about AI and emerging technologies, right? So in Egypt, when we started developing the AI strategy, and as you said, there was a piece that was internal, but also working with international organizations to see how we can govern this thing and what help we can get, frankly. And we did work a lot with Microsoft. It became evident very, very quickly that in the, I'll call it the West, just being politically incorrect, there was this big debate around the AI race, the global AI race. Thankfully, we don't really seem to use that term that much anymore, but 2019 or so, it was everything. And I'd go to some of these fora and I'd say, well, how can you talk about a race if not everyone is starting from the same point? It's not a race. And yes, you have a handful of countries that are talking about how do we upskill our labor force so they don't lose their jobs and become AI engineers instead of, I don't know, something else that can be automated. In the Global South, it's a very different conversation. It's how many people can read and write, how many people have to learn math, how many people have to learn computer science, and then how many people can be educated on AI. It's a much, much steeper pyramid to climb. And so we developed this framework consisting of two pyramids, because we're a nation of pyramid builders. And one of them was for technical skills, which do have a pretty substantial breakdown themselves. But the other one was for non-technical skills, research, domain experts, policy, et cetera, And what we're also seeing is that none of this can be done, as you said, without the proper infrastructure, be it data, be it connectivity, being compute, but also that you can't really make the argument for infrastructure by itself. You have to link it to the development agenda. You have to link it to the use case. We had a side event during UNGA on digital public infrastructure, and we had a colleague from the Kenyan government, and the first thing he started talking about was digital payments, digital identity, digital education, all the things that this infrastructure enables. So I'll just end here and say that we absolutely need to link the infrastructure agenda and the environmental agenda, because now I work for UNEP, to the development agenda. Otherwise, we just won't get very far in the Global South.
Yeah, thank you. And I think you hit on so many important points. But I think the other thing that's really important about what you said is, who are we talking about here? And how are their lives going to be different and better, right? And that, I think, is a really important kind of reality check and level setting aspect to this discussion. And Michael, I'd love to turn to you and build on some of the points that Sally touched on. And when we think about the building blocks of what it's going to take, not just to get the infrastructure in place and not just to make sure the technology is accessible, but that it's utilized, talk a little bit about digital skills and digital literacy and inclusive design. You know, these are all equally important when it comes to the uptake. And, you know, at AARP, you are, of course, thinking about older adults and what that means in terms of economy, the health of communities, and, of course, of the labor force as well. So many different aspects here. But when we think about individuals and communities in particular, where does, you know, the skills, the literacy, and the inclusivity in design come into play?
Yeah, and you know, those are all great points. And the interesting thing is there's not one solution that works across all of these different barriers, and nor do they work across different types of technology sectors or hardware, software, or parts of the globe. So it really, as Teresa was mentioning, it really does take partnerships who understand their role, their swim lane, working together in order to bridge the gap. I'll give one example. An affiliate of AARP's is Oats and Senior Planet. We provide training to older adults nationwide here in the United States. And the model that has worked is sort of a three-legged stool. We have to have the boots on the ground in communities who know the community and can provide the hands-on training that people are looking for in order to develop their higher digital skills. It requires curriculum developers who understand how, with the accelerated pace of technology, what's needed in those communities. Is it basic skills? Is it workforce skills? Is it health and wellness skills? Is it media literacy skills? And designing the right curriculum for the right audience. And then it requires funders at a higher level, whether it be government or tech sector, private sector, who have a vested interest in greater adoption, all working together. That's a lot of partners working together towards goals just to raise digital literacy in specific communities. And you multiply that times all of the different barriers that people face in underserved communities in getting to the level that we're talking about, where people feel very confident about using the tools that are available.
Yeah, thank you for that. And as I'm listening to you speak, something that comes to my mind is also, how do we know what we know, and how do we update our approaches, our beliefs, based on the evidence that's presented to us and that we find along the way? And, you know, this is also the social scientist in me thinking about data and evidence gaps. And Teresa, I'd love to bring you back into the conversation, and in particular ask you about exactly this. How are you leveraging data to inform your strategy and to shape your cross-sectoral partnerships? What does that look like in practice?
I think it's a couple things. I mean, you know, we always try to figure out where we can bring data to help see a problem. And I think that's where it's the most kind of useful thing. And so with the connectivity work, but not just the connectivity work, we built a digital equity dashboard for the United States that, you know, maps where their people are connected, but it also overlays additional demographic data. And so then you have a really different picture, and you can do better targeted intervention or funding or whatever you need to do. You can do things better. I think we are also just discovering really interesting new ways of using data, whether it's, we were doing a lot with global satellite imagery, you know, where we can sort of see things from the sky that we couldn't see from the ground. And sometimes that's, you can't get up close because of geographic limitations. Sometimes it's, you know, scary things are happening on the ground. But also, I mean, just as an example, it's slightly different from this topic, but we're using it to document the war crimes in Ukraine. And so we can see impact to infrastructure, we can see impact to hospitals, we can see impact to you know, schools and water towers and things like that. And this is just a really interesting new way of thinking about what can you see from the sky that you can't see from the ground. But for a lot of the work that we're talking about on digital inclusion, I mean, it's really just figuring out how you layer data sets, working with partners who can ask you the key questions. Because I think that's one of the things that is really clear. Like, we think about things and with the data we have available, but when somebody says to us, can you see this problem? Like, do you have a way of looking at this problem that we don't know how to look at? And so we can do that. And I think it just really helps you ground your conversation. It helps you ground your approaches to trying to start to address problems.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And when we think about addressing problems, and again, as I'm listening to you speak, I actually think back to an earlier conversation this morning that was taking place a little while ago. And going back to this issue of the role of technology and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, we had the Danish tech ambassador talking, and she was making some really important points about the potential of technology and the potential of AI in particular, but also being really frank and saying, look, these are political, social, economic problems, and we shouldn't think that there's going to be a technology silver bullet, right, to solve all of these things. And while that is true, and for sure that is true, there's also really important questions that are being asked right now in terms of what will artificial intelligence leveraged and deployed to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals look like. And that's something that I think each of you have touched on. And so this is a question for all of you to elaborate on, because I do think it's top of mind for a lot of people, which is when we think about digital inclusion, where do opportunities lie in terms of the role of AI? How can people understand what that will mean and feel excited and optimistic about it as well, instead of just trepidation?
Yeah. Do you want me to
go ahead?
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I think it's a really, really good question. And I think one of the places we've seen sort of the most well, first I will just say we need connectivity. Otherwise, people aren't going to be served by AI. We need electricity, then we need connectivity. Otherwise, AI is not going to serve. I mean, the digital divide just gets broader. But where we've seen some really, really great examples is around accessibility for people with disabilities. You know, there's an app where you can kind of just hold it up and you can see the world, and it will describe to you what you're seeing. And so you can imagine, I don't actually have it on my phone because it's in preview, but I could hold it up and it would describe this. It would just describe the room to me. Which is really cool. Think about it if you're in your closet and you're trying to find your red shirt. There is a service where you can call and have a human volunteer currently that will tell you your red shirt is 3 over from the corner. But if you don't want to invite a human into your closet, it might be cool if you could just use your smartphone. Similarly, for people who are neurodiverse, the ability to process a lot of information, to summarize a lot of information. There's just some really, really exciting use cases for individual people, and then I think there is this ability to see the world from the sky that is, using AI technology to help us understand things like deforestation, that helps us understand almost immediately after a disaster strikes where the harm has really hit people the hardest. We saw, if you saw maps on the New York Times about the damage in Lahaina, describing how many buildings had been affected by the fire, that came from the partnership we have with Planet. And so there's some really, really cool stuff. We just need to target the work that way.
Yeah, and if I may, I'd actually love to pick up on this point about the environment. And Michael, I'm going to come back to you in a second, but Sally, you also talked about this a little bit earlier in terms of environmental degradation, sustainability. And so I guess this is actually a question for both of you in many ways. When I think of the Secretary General's Our Common Agenda, and I know it's something that all three of you have worked on, and he outlines what are the most important issues that we as a global community need to be thinking about and addressing. Digital inclusion is one of them, and what does it look like, and what is it going to take to get the internet in the hands of everybody on Earth, every single person. That's his goal. But also climate change and the realities of accelerating climate impact. And so where do these two pieces come together? And I'm specifically thinking about not just the most vulnerable communities, especially in low and middle income countries, but also, again, who are we talking about? Older adults who are uniquely disadvantaged or may need to have access to certain things in terms of their ability to be resilient in the face of those. So would you both come in on that and how you're thinking about these dual challenges?
Oh, thank you. Let me give you a couple of examples of things we're doing at UNEP. And of course, the UN Environment Programme is about more than climate. So we look at climate, nature, which is biodiversity, and pollution. So I'll give two examples of two systems we have, and I'll make the point that what we actually need is two things: collaboration and governance. And so the first one is called the International Methane Emissions Observatory, which is an online platform that tracks methane emissions around the world and using AI and machine learning, and gives early warnings for methane hotspots once they are generated, so that we can send alerts to member states so they can deploy their mitigation measures. And it's actually been deployed successfully in a number of countries so far. The other one is called Countermeasure, which is, those of you who were at the SDG Action Weekend might have seen me present that, which is a very cool little project that was implemented by one of my colleagues in Asia to detect plastic pollutants in rivers. And the beauty about it is that it doesn't only utilize cutting-edge technology, computer vision, and so on, and tries to trace all the plastic pollutants to the source so we can actually stop the problem before it happens, but that it also involves the local community. So there's a citizen science aspect to it. When we detect a hotspot for plastic pollution, we contact the school and they send a whole class of students to that river to pick out the plastic pollutants and remove them. So there's an element of education there as well, and involving the local community in this. The challenge is, how do we scale these? How does, the local community around the Niger River in Africa know that we're doing this for the Ganges in Asia? Mm-hmm. And this is where I see part of the role of the UN is as a convener of these types of solutions and capabilities. And of course, the other side is governance, where we need to build bridges between existing governance structures and help where they don't exist, as opposed to trying to develop something that works for everyone everywhere.
Michael?
Yeah, I want to reference some AARP research that came out last week, citing how unprepared older adults are in the United States for natural disasters, and how unconnected people are to the trusted sources that can provide preparedness information, as well as how to react to fast-moving natural disasters. And if people aren't connected here in the United States to those trusted sources, certainly globally the connection rates are even lower. Things are moving faster now. The climate change is clearly a lot of change that we all have to be connected to. And we know that if we're not connected to the most up-to-date information, we're not prepared. We don't have those types of information sources that are trusted in the age of misinformation. It's going to cause deaths in some cases, not just natural disasters, but epidemics, pandemics, wars, and so forth. So the underserved there again are put at a disadvantage in these situations. The second thing I wanted to say, with regards to global change, there's a lot of evidence that decarbonization is directly tied to economic affluence in communities, and there's a lot of new data coming out globally that communities that are and actually, Maisha, I think you touched on this on some of your research with FP, that communities that are adopting digital skills in the workforce are have increased profitability and economic abundance in those communities. So that's a faster path. That's a pathway to decarbonization, I believe.
Yeah, and actually, thank you for evoking some of the research at FP Analytics that we've been able to do in partnership with AARP. And I think, listening to you speak, one of the things that I'm reminded of is, what does this mean in action in terms of gender disaggregated data, age disaggregated data, the urban and rural divide? And you're right, across the board, there is evidence to demonstrate that potential. But I think it's also a matter of identifying interventions that are targeted for the intersectional challenges that people are facing. And so we know, for example, that older women are going to be facing unique challenges, and in many ways, certain things that are disproportionate in terms of the burden that they carry, right? And so there too, digital inclusion has a really important role to play in not just alleviating, but also unleashing the potential that those communities hold. Michael, you touched on something that I think is so important, and thank you for bringing this up, because I hadn't been thinking about it backstage when we were talking, but I do want to take a minute to address, which is disinformation. And this is a huge challenge. We all know this in a number of ways in terms of democracy and faith in institutions and so on and so forth. But also when we're talking about digital inclusion and the ability and willingness of underserved populations to trust and effectively utilize technology once they are connected, disinformation is a significant barrier and one that is concerning in many ways. And so I love, again, this is a question for all of you, and maybe Teresa, you'd like to go first, but I'd love to hear how you're thinking about this and also trying to address that challenge.
It's a big question. I'll go fast. I won't cover everything. One, I think when we think about getting people online for the first time, we're doing a lot of thinking about, okay, what kind of tools do you need to equip people with to make sure they understand what, sort of arena they've entered, so that they're, better consumers of information. We do a lot of partnerships to think about media literacy. And then we're really thinking about where are the places in which our technology has the potential to make things worse or better. And, really thinking a lot about what can you build into the products, what can you build into the technology to help people have better signals about what they're consuming. Can we use AI to detect deep fakes, for example? Yes, but eventually the AI will catch up with itself and won't become undetectable. So how do we start to give people signals that something is trustworthy rather than looking for the deep fake? So can you build in watermarking? Can you start to help people look for something like the equivalent of the lock that you look for when you look for a secure website? So we're thinking about this in lots of layers, thinking about it with specific populations, kids, aging adults, people around the world. It's a super complicated problem that we need to keep at because it's very, very important.
Michael?
And echo everything Teresa said, and I think this week there's been a lot of conversation about this that I won't repeat, but I will say our research shows that older adults who don't trust technology won't use the technology. Mm-hmm. And speaking personally, the thing that worries me the most, just as personally, there's so much amazing innovation that's coming down the pipe using artificial intelligence to help older adults with different stages of life. And if there are bad actors that are giving a bad reputation to artificial intelligence as a whole, my personal concern is that it could taint the good use cases for AI that are out there.
Sally?
So it's a huge problem for the environment, especially for climate change. There is a lot of misinformation, disinformation out there. What we're doing about it is we're actually building a large language model, and I'm personally not a big fan of LLMs per se, but we are building one because we think this is a legitimate use case to be able to answer questions about the environment and about climate change from authoritative sources, mm-hmm. so that people can actually find the right information with the stamp of approval of the UN. So hopefully that will help.
Thank you. And I think those are some great examples in terms of trying new approaches and seeing how they work. But as you said, Teresa, realizing that this is an evolving problem and we don't yet have a full grasp of it. And so our approaches need to be agile as well.
Just don't trust what you see on the internet, right? Without verifying. Verify. That image might not be true.
Yeah. Let me see if there are any questions from the audience that we can take before we wrap up. Yes, and if you wouldn't mind, actually, would you like to help? Thank you.
Thank you. This is a fascinating panel. I really enjoyed it. I'm Sunita Nadamuni. I used to be at Dell until recently, leading global social innovation. We were working with Government of India on developing a technology platform for non-communicable disease screening, and it enrolled about 300 million people. So we were really interested in seeing how it can be taken to other countries. Right? Now, the technology part seems to be very straightforward because DPGs, DPI, that's, there are institutions that will help you take the technology. But as all of you have been saying, the hard part that we spent in the last 5 years were building the ecosystem, working with all the institutions, the program guidelines, policy, laws, the training on the ground. There are no frameworks for that, right? But without that, you can't, without assessing the digital maturity of other countries, it seems like you're just going to set it up for failure by saying, oh, you have a DPG here, Government of India wants to give it as a DPG, we take it there. So I wanted to understand your thoughts about what efforts are going on in that space, because I think that's really important.
Thank you so much. I think that's a great question.
Anyone want to jump in?
Sure. So, yes, totally agree. And one of the things we're doing, and I'm not saying this will solve everything, but part of this World Environment Situation Room that we're building, one of its purposes is actually to allow that exchange. It won't solve the problem of lack of DPIs or DPGs in certain countries, and it won't solve the regulatory problem, but at least it will show what's possible, and it will facilitate the exchange of technology, capacity, and financing. So hopefully that's a step, but like I said, it won't solve everything.
Well, and I think your point is also really well taken in terms of where we started this conversation, the types of partnerships and cross-sectoral collaboration that are going to be required and the role that governments have to play in that effort, right? How do you create an enabling environment, and how do you ensure that the types of work that each of you are trying to steward can flourish, and that the policy environment and regulatory environment exists to enable that work? So
yeah, and just real quickly, the only thing I can say that we've tried is putting together kind of the learnings after we do these pilot programs, putting together a playbook. We've just published with USAID how to get more women online based on the lessons we've learned from the partnerships. I don't know if that actually gets to it. I think lots of people have tried that. But we're trying not to sort of say we don't know how to do it all the time, but when we learn stuff, we'll share it.
Yeah.
And I think that's super important for everybody in the room, is to when you learn something that works, just share it in case it works for somebody else.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we are unfortunately out of time, and it's a really rich conversation. We've touched on so many different topics, and I think also speaks to how complex this agenda is, but also the many, many opportunities for partnership and collaboration. So thank you to each of you for the work that you are doing and for participating in today's discussion. It's been a pleasure to be with you. Thank you, Teresa, Michael, and Sally.
Thank you. Almost just fell.
And now please welcome to the stage the United Nations Envoy on Technology, Amandeep Singh Gill, for discussion on global goals in a digital era with FP's Ravi Agrawal.
Watch your step here. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, I have Amandeep Singh Gill. He is the UN Tech Envoy. This is a busy week for you.
Yes, busy, but exciting.
Yeah. You know, one thing that's come up again and again in many of the discussions today is that tech has traditionally, historically, not been a huge part of this week at the United Nations, but this year feels different. Just give us a sense of, from what you've seen as the tech envoy, what's getting done on the tech front?
In 2017, when the Secretary General first mentioned artificial intelligence in his statement, he was in a lonely crowd of 2 or 3. And this week, we've seen dozens of leaders mention digital data and AI in the context of not only the misuse and how to get their governance right, but also how to leverage them for catching up on the sustainable development goals. So it's very nice to see that happen. It's also very nice to see a kind of a more strategic approach to technology solutions, like looking at digital public infrastructure, so the connectivity piece, data starts to flow, and then the data protection and empowerment layers. How does data become more interoperable? How do we raise the quality? And then finally, the analytics layer where AI comes in. So people are not looking at AI as a fix or, connectivity as something that'll just get the GDP growth going, but more strategic, integrated view of the different pieces that need to come together, human capacity as well, to make it happen.
So let's talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. And as I'm sure all of you know who are here, while we're trying to find an optimistic angle here, I mean, the progress in general on the 17 SDGs has been awful. The world is far behind where it needs to be. So with that backdrop, where could digital technologies help? And how do you get countries to collaborate on that to move the needle on the SDGs?
Yes, I think you're right on the equation. It's quite dismal. 15% versus 85%. So at halftime, we are only up to speed on 15% of the goals and the targets, detailed targets. So we need to catch up. And there's no way we can do that without having more investments. Finance is certainly important. So the SG has called for a 500 billion annual SDG stimulus. It's the minimum we need. But then there is technology. And I believe that technology can really be the magic ingredient in the SDGs equation. And there are two areas where technology, particularly data and AI, can provide acceleration. One is allowing governments, decision makers, various participants in the development process, including communities, to have a better sense of where they are. So real-time knowledge of where the gaps are, who's getting left out, point sources of environmental pollution, where are plastics coming from when they flow into the ocean. So a whole disaster resilience. I was at this event just before this. Half the world doesn't have multi-hazard disaster warning systems, so which costs a lot of lives and economic losses. So all that can be accelerated with digital technologies in particular. And the second aspect is the research and development and innovation side, where AI is becoming a big factor, data is becoming a big factor. Now, you know that monoculture doesn't scale, but a forest scales. So we need more innovation for the SDGs, and we need more participation in the innovation ecosystem. So we need to use the accelerating power of AI for R&D. You see the progress on protein folding and other areas of scientific discovery, and kind of ground that into the SDG space, whether it's maternal and child health, etc. And last, very quickly, I think also bridging the last mile gap in terms of taking the innovation and the solutions to more people. And I want to give a quick example there. There is a civil society organization, Digital Green, that is working across Kenya, Ethiopia, and India with ministries of agriculture, with farmers, and bringing down the cost of agriculture extension, teaching climate smart agriculture to farmers. So earlier, if one extension effort needed $35, now with AI, it is down to 35 cents, a 100-fold decrease. And 2 to 3 times more women farmers are accessing this. Simple ChatGPT 3.5 in the background. The data is the YouTube videos, the Google Sheets, the call center chat logs that this NGO has developed over the years. So there is a basis, and that's an important piece. Without that data, you can't do AI. And then you use the Google USM, Universal Speech Model, to have a chat interface in the local language. Simply using WhatsApp, farmers can access the best solutions for the problems that they have.
So I have to ask you a tough question here. A lot of what you're describing to me sounds heartening, to me sounds optimistic, to me sounds hopeful, but these technologies have been around for a while, for a decade plus, and still we are, as we were discussing, far behind on the SDG goals. Why do you think that now suddenly, from 2015 to 2023, not enough got done, but now you think over the next 7 years, these same technologies will suddenly provide dividends that they didn't before?
Ravi, because we now have some success stories. So, seeing is believing. In India, for instance, through the JAM Trinity, low costs of mobile data, more bank accounts being open, and the Aadhaar, the digital identity layer. So several 100 million people have come into the financial mainstream. And that would have taken, according to the World Bank, by traditional methods, 50 years, 5 decades. So you compress that into 7 to 9 years. So people have looked at these examples, and I could multiply them. Philippines, monitoring of the road infrastructure projects, the DIME project, the digital infrastructure monitoring and evaluation project. So people look at these examples, Bangladesh example, Rwanda example, say, oh, others are doing it, so we can also do it. And I think that's change. And I think there is also a scale aspect. There are more people connected online. Data flows have gone up. More tools and resources, including open source tools and resources, are available. And frankly, international organizations have also woken up to the fact, and they are making their own efforts across the UN system, from the International Telecommunication Union to UNDP and others. So they are being more proactive on this.
And of course, 1 billion people plus are still offline as well. So there's more gains and progress to be made on that front. Let me ask you this. We're here at the UN. Tech has emerged this week, as I said, as an area of optimism in general. It seems like, other than the AI aspect, which is both optimism and fear. But I'm curious what you think about the UN as a forum to get things done. There's a growing sense of criticism, of frustration about the state of the UN. In many ways, the UN is broken. The Charter has been made a mockery of with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Security Council can barely agree on anything when Russia has a veto power. China and America are at loggerheads, tend to disagree with each other on major issues. So, you know, you work at the UN. Do you feel like you're being stymied in many of the things you want to get done?
Right. No, I don't think what you're describing is the state of the world. And
it's also the state of the UN.
The UN is us. Like, in the UN is not just the Secretariat, but the UN is all its 193 member states. It's a member state-led organization. So if there are all these issues, you know, we are kind of reflecting the state of the world. But that doesn't mean that we should accept things as they are and not make the effort. I think the Charter's values and principles still resonate. It's a powerful document. Yes, it's not being respected by everyone, and that is unfortunate. We have to push back against that. But the UN on a regular basis is an important beacon of hope for hundreds of millions of people who face food insecurity, who are struggling with climate change-induced disasters. So day in and day out, the UN works on those issues, on standards and protocols that and norms that keep everything from our Wi-Fi routers to how aeroplanes fly people around the world. So there is that kind of a unseen, uncelebrated aspect of the UN that goes on. I look at technology, data, and AI as a kind of a silver lining on these dark clouds. So in my work as the tech envoy, looking at AI governance, for instance, you know, the Secretary General is going to, by the end of the month, put together this global AI advisory body on AI governance. There I see across these divides that you mentioned, and also going beyond member states, looking at the private sector players, there is a great interest and support for the convening role of the UN in bringing different perspectives, different voices together. You know, at the end of the day, you can't say climate change is the problem of Europe or that of someone else. You know, it's everyone's problem. And AI is going to be everyone's problem. It's a humanity level issue.
But respectfully, I don't think the criticism is that the UN has failed to convene. I think the criticism is that the UN fails to get things done.
Right, yes. So that is fair in many ways, but I would contest that from my own experience. For 2 years, I chaired a negotiation on using AI in weapon systems. Does that align with international humanitarian law, international human rights law? 125 countries, including China, US, Russia, very different views. But we managed to land consensus on some very, very important guiding principles, as AI comes more into these weapon systems. So this was just a few years back. So I could multiply these examples, protecting some of the ocean spaces. Again, recently we've reached agreement. So there are these areas where we are constantly making progress on. I mean, the headlines often focus on what's wrong, but not what's getting done and what is going right. And in my area, I'm particularly confident that we'll continue to build on these successes.
Well, as someone who's often responsible for the headlines, I'll take that criticism. But here we are. AI, there's, Biden used the words peril and promise in his speech. Do you see that as an equal split, a 50-50 split of peril and promise, or is the peril just much greater than the promise?
I think it's quite nuanced, and it also depends on where you are. Where you sit determines where you stand. Like in Asia, I see more optimism. In Africa, I see a mix of optimism and concern. And people are not looking for easy answers. It's not a dichotomy. This is a repurposable technology. And there's also the question of who's participating in it, who's creating it, who's governing it. There are questions around equity and access. So there is the risk side of it. We have to get that right. In the now category, the medium-term category, shifts in the job market, etc., and in the long-term category, where some people talk of existential risks. But we also have to get the opportunity landscape right. If it is 7 or 10 companies that are going to use AI for the world, then that's not going to cut it. I think we need probably 7 million, 70 million social entrepreneurs, private sector companies around the world leveraging AI for good. And then obviously the promise in terms of promise for humanity, solving these societal challenges by accelerating research and development around climate change, the plastics problem, and many, many more health.
Let me see if I can take a question from the audience. Sir, I saw your hand there. Let me see if there's anyone else. Maybe we can take a couple at the same time. All right, sir, we'll come to you.
Is it on? Hello.
I think it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Srikanth. I completely agree with you with respect to the Jam Trinity and the financial inclusion. In fact, I was the CTO of the Aadhaar project in India. The question is, the reason why digital public infrastructure worked in India was because it was created, the protocols were created, blessed, and endorsed by the government, which is the correct authority, if you will, for public goods. I don't see that in many countries. The corporate sectors sort of takes the role to create identity systems and so on, and public goods is not their end goal, and rightly so. Profitability is, markets are their goals. So do you see, as we try to take this message and platform of DPIs to the rest of the world towards sustainable development goals, do you see other countries also recognize that DPIs have to be supported by governments? They have to bless them. It cannot be sort of abrogated to the corporate sector to carry this responsibility.
Right. I think each country will come to this from their own experience. India's experience, while applicable to many other locations, is fairly unique. Even in terms of safeguards, the Supreme Court came in, the Parliament passed a law, and civil society made sure that the right balance was created. And at the end of the day, the tech stack comes from a volunteer community. The government adopted it, but it was this community based in Bangalore that created it, and you are part of that community. So it was a mixture of, and today if you look at the stack, the private sector is an important player. So at the end of the day, digital public infrastructures are not an infrastructure in the traditional sense. They are an innovation ecosystem, common rails, guardrails, where both public sector and private sector can play. So I see the market, the government, and civil society coming together nicely in this. And that's perhaps the most powerful lesson coming out of the India experience, The other lesson is that each country would have its own persuasive use cases. For India, it was financial inclusion. That really made everyone sit up and got that societal level collaboration going, and now more things are coming on. But in other countries, it may be another use case. Agriculture and food security may be the use case that helps build trust and the confidence in the ministries, such as the Ministry of Finance. Oh, you talk about digital, but we are not sure we should be putting money in there. So each country will have to discover its own use cases. And we have to kind of unbundle the DPI concept in terms of, what are the public goods that are, that you Lego-like you can put together in different contexts. And I see that as very promising now that the G20 has agreed on a DPI framework. Last Sunday at the Digital Day, my office and the UNDP together launched a DPI Safeguards initiative to build an international standard to ensure safety, inclusion, human rights, and sustainability. So we need to kind of create those spaces where learning can happen and we can keep the standards high.
I'll ask you one last question. It seems, we have another hand. Let me go to the audience then. Yes, if you can tell us your name and the question, please.
Hi, my name is Masa. I also work at the UN, so thank you for that great response about all the great things that UN does that's not often headlines. Someone mentioned before the analogy of how there's talk about regulating AI, much like we try to regulate like through IAEA, nuclear technology, and I know you have a PhD in this topic on nuclear learning, which is really interesting. So given what we know about the challenges with the member states within, and how the tensions are within IAEA, so on the one hand, there's countries saying, for example, there's non-compliance, though other countries saying that those who have it are saying that countries who don't have it shouldn't have it. So there's a lot of issues in that space. But as someone had pointed out correctly, I think it's perhaps because it's more measurable, it might be easier to monitor than AI, because it's not just states that, even though we would want states to comply with whatever UN brings out in terms of governance in this space, there's all types of actors that can have access to AI. So even if governments are on board with such an agreement, there's challenges. So given the work that you're leading and really important things that are coming ahead in the international community, what's your thoughts on using the IAEA, or for those who don't know what that is basically nuclear international governance mechanisms for nuclear technology in the AI space? Thank you.
And if I can just add on to that, and we'll close with this, the nuclear analogy is used for a lot of things in terms of a potential governance framework for AI, but also in terms of creating a world of haves and have-nots. Absolutely. Which is a phrase we've used for years with nuclear. So how do you think about that?
I think that's a great point, too. Nuclear, there is a tangibility. There are only two paths to the bomb: high enriched uranium and separated plutonium. So you know the choke points. There are discrete production processes. What are the sensitive materials? And the non-proliferation regime has been built around that understanding of tech and how it translates into the weapon. And the IA is not only about non-proliferation, but it's also about nuclear safety and security. So again, something to think about in terms of the safety side of AI. And then there is the peaceful uses side, in the uses in agriculture, for generating electricity and so on, promoting that. So it's tempting to think of the IA as a model, and I've seen some writings that talk about AI in terms of choke points. There's licensing. This is the kind of technological terms we use in non-proliferation, intangible controls, tangible controls. But I don't think there are any easy translations. AI is a very different beast. The private sector's involvement, the fact that thousands of people, the AI chain itself, AI is not like separate from the data side and the digital public infrastructure side. The data value chain has its own complexities. So we'll have to be more creative with this. Look at this question of haves and have-nots, access and equity, in addition to the promise and the peril. And also look at it in terms of other exemplars. IMO, the International Maritime Organization, Civil Aviation Organization, where standards are set, but their implementation is with national, or the IPCC model. Of course, this will have to be multi-stakeholder, how a group of scientific experts from around the world comes together to build consensus on what's most concerning in terms of the risk, for instance, in the AI space. So there are good examples, and this AI advisory body that the Secretary General is convening, and yesterday we had an event on this issue, very well attended. So that will look at these kind of issues, models of governance, risk mapping, opportunities, and also what's happening in the governance landscape, how we can build more connective tissue on this. Today, we are focused on the consequences, and I'm not ruling this out. At some stage, we might have to start worrying about the capabilities also. Then it becomes more like a nuclear discussion. If LLM surprised us, even those who were experts, 5-10 years down the lane, we may have something else. So let's keep it under watch.
Amandeep Singh Gill, thank you so much for your time. Really great to chat.
Thank you.
Okay, and that wraps our tech summit here, but we have a lot more coming up in this room at FP's events. So I want to thank all of you for sticking around and engaging with us. Terrific questions as well in this session and in previous ones, for which I'm very grateful. We love engaging with you. I've had conversations with many of you here today as well, and I've just learned so much from all of you and the work you do, which is so important at a forum like this and in a week like this one. We have a few more events coming up today at 1 p.m. If you're interested in energy and how it intersects with the world of foreign policy, then you want to come right back here. That's at 1 p.m. Definitely recommend some of the great speakers we have on that issue. And then later today, if you are curious about how to fix the world's refugee crisis, we have a live taping of a podcast. The podcast is called Global Reboot. That is going to be at 6 p.m. right here. And our guest there is the Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights. That's Kelly Clements. She has done a lot of thinking about how to fix the global refugee crisis. You won't want to miss that. That's 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Drinks are involved as well. So do come back. Hope to see you around. Thank you for being here, and thank you for being a great audience.
Thanks, Ravi.